I'm going to encourage you on the paper that you have to kind of write your own sentences or examples for each one. A lot of this is going to seem sort of very basic when we review it. However, the first couple are the ones you make the most mistakes on. So the sentences are sort of dumbed down a little bit, but the concept still applies. So when you guys start to get into those lengthier sentences, that's when you have to be even more aware of the rules that go with all of the commas. So with this review, there are always exceptions to the rules, but this covers pretty much all the bases when it comes to how do we use commas, and we practice those in our mug sentences. So hopefully a lot of this is review, or it'll just kind of solidify the rules you've been taught pretty much your whole life. But like I said, the examples I have on that paper and the examples you're going to see up here are dumbed down a little bit, but I'm trying to break down the essential concept of the rules. So our first one is using a comma in a compound sentence. This is the most common mistake that I find on all of your papers. And this is probably rule number one you've learned since the beginning of time. And the mistake is not that you forget to put the comma in. It's usually you put a comma in when it's not necessary. So with this number one rule, you guys always nail this first part. I really enjoy football. Complete thought. We're good to go. It's the second part. You can't always assume that anytime you put the word "and" in a sentence that a comma goes there. You have to read what comes after the "and." So in this case, my wife enjoys baseball. That's a complete thought. And I know my comma goes there. So what you guys need to take note of when you are writing your papers is to check what follows the "and." Because if it's not a complete sentence, you do not need this comma. So take a second for your rule number one and just come up with your own simple sentence to solidify, all right, I've got to have two complete sentences in order to make this correct, to have this rule work. So remember, just because you see "and" does not mean it gets a comma. That's the number one mistake I see on junior papers, putting a comma where you don't need it. So rule number two, I feel like you guys got this rule down pretty good. I rarely see an issue with this other than I just want to reinforce the fact that you got to use that Oxford comma. So here we took extra clothes, fishing poles, and some snacks. You have to make sure that last item in the list gets that comma. You're going to start to see more in publishings, like for newspapers and magazines, that they're leaving this out. However, ACT purposes and for our purposes in here, you want to get used to using that Oxford comma. No one's going to tell you you're wrong if you're using the Oxford comma. If you leave it out, there will be people who will tell you you did it wrong. So just make sure in a list of things, you guys are putting commas everywhere. So go ahead, give number two, come up with your own little sentence, and jot that on the line for me. So rule number three, this is the rule where you feel that natural pause happen. You typically have a dependent clause or a prepositional phrase that makes you feel like you need to pause within the sentence. This is also that rule when I tell you guys when we do our mug sentences, if you take it away, you're still left with a complete thought. So that's the trick for number three. before the fireworks, we laid our blankets down. If we take that away, we're still left with our independent clause, our main sentence. So this one is an easy one to figure out whether or not you need a comma, because if you take it away, you are left with a complete thought. So go ahead for rule number 3, come up with your own example, practice that one. Rule number 4 is the interrupter rule, and this can be words or phrases that fall within your sentence. So, of course, in my opinion, the Red Devils are the best. If I got rid of this interrupter, I'm still left with a complete thought. So it's a similar trick to rule number 3. If you take out what's within the commas and you're still left with a complete sentence, you know you have used that rule correctly. So go ahead and give rule number 4 a try, practicing your interrupter. Rule number 5 is similar to the list rule. It just, in this case, applies to adjectives. So you want to use a comma to separate descriptive adjectives. So this summer was fun, exciting, and hot. I have to make sure that I use that Oxford comma when I'm using a list of adjectives to describe something. So an easy one, review of the previous rule, but same concept applies. So go ahead and come up with your number 5 sentence. Rule number 6 is our dialogue rule, or our quotation rule, which we have been practicing now for several weeks. Whenever you're using a speech tag, or if you're using a compound sentence, that is when the commas can be used to set off dialogue in the fanboy. But for this case, just simplified, please don't be late for class, comma, said Mrs. Miser. The comma goes within the quotation. If I were to reverse this, Mrs. Miser said, comma, please don't be late for class, the comma would go outside of the quotation marks. You guys know this rule, we've been practicing it for a while, but go ahead and come up with your own dialogue for number 6, just as an example. So rule number 7, this example actually is a combination of 2 of the rules, but the main thing here is that you're separating dates and addresses. So Orlando, Florida is getting separated, and October 1st, 1971 is being separated by a comma, but this is also an interrupter sentence. Disney World, located in Orlando, Florida, opened on October 1st, 1971. If I took this interrupter element out, I'd be left with Disney World opened on October 1st, 1971. Still a complete thought. That's how I double check to make sure I put my commas in the right place. But for you guys, just pick a place to write down and a date to write down for rule number 7. I know that's like way, way throwback. You guys have known that rule forever, but just as a review. So rule number 8 is very similar to the other list rules. We're just applying it to verb phrases in this case. So we copied papers, we filed documents, and we worked on tests. One thing that I want you to notice, this is called parallel structure. This is something we'll talk about a little bit more down the road. This is a big ACT thing, and it's a very common mistake to make. But I want you to notice with this sentence, we copied, we filed, and we worked. All of these are nouns, all are verbs. All of these are in past tense. And so you don't want to have a situation where you're saying something like, we copied papers, filed documents, and we will be working on tests in the future. You want to avoid phrases like that because it's not following parallel structure. So another example of that could be, we copied papers, filed documents, and my friend Susie decided she was going to work on tests. So I'm breaking that structure. And this is just a good example of proper parallel structure. We copied, we filed, we worked. So when you're working on a list, you want those things in your list to be the same. You don't want to jump around with different types of parts of speech. You want to stay consistent. So we'll practice that skill more though. Rule number 9. This is when we set off appositives, and appositives make me positive of who I'm talking about or what I'm talking about. A lot of times it's just extra information. A positive is just a fancy word for it. So Mickey Mouse, the mouse who wears a blue hat, is the main attraction in Disney World. It's kind of like an interrupter. I can take that information out. However, it's called an appositive. It gives me more information about the person, place, thing, idea that I'm talking about. So you can test to make sure you did it correctly by reading what's outside of the commas to make sure it's a complete thought. So go ahead, give rule number 9 a go. And that information is not necessary to the meaning of the sentence. So rule number 10 is very similar to rule number 9. It's just not an appositive. So it's a different type of information being provided within the commas. We don't have to worry about the technicality of it. That's kind of irrelevant. You just need to know how to use commas correctly. So for this example here, Mickey Mouse with his blue hat is the main attraction in Disney World. This is phrased a little bit different. It's no longer an appositive in this case. But it's just non-essential information, extra stuff. If I took it out, I know I would be left with a complete sentence, therefore I've used my commas correctly. So it's very similar to rule number 9. A lot of these rules are very similar concerning commas. It's just that what's inside of the commas is a little bit different. So go ahead and give number 10 a practice. Rule number 11 is easy, just a greeting whenever you're addressing someone in a letter, more of an informal letter. You want to put a comma after it. For more business type style letters, you want to put a colon and that is the end of our comma rules.